Yeah, so welcome, Steve. Really excited to have you here with us for this intimate conversation on sourcing and stewarding Aletheia in the world. And I know that you have been doing this work of Aletheia for the past 13 plus years, kind of sourcing Aletheia as an integral psycho-spiritual development approach, as well as a coach training school as well, and working with hundreds of students in that process and colleagues as well, and creating something really beautiful that is so just what these times require, in a way, like really like off this moment, meeting this moment of fragmentation and metacrisis. And I've personally been incredibly impacted and transformed by being part of the Aletheia community, both as a human being as well as a coach and deep practitioner. And yeah, so much gratitude for that. And I'm really excited to have you share with us a bit about sourcing and stewarding Aletheia in the world. And then we'll have time for questions after that as well, to really dive into what is of most interest in this group. And welcome.
Yeah.
Do you guys know each other?
No, we don't.
Steve.
Hi, I'm Steve.
This is
Hi, Steve. Alon, nice to meet you.
Say your name again. The internet blipped.
Alon.
Alon. Great. Welcome, Alon.
Yeah. Is there a way we can hide ourselves and make him bigger? Great.
So yeah, I'm really thankful to be here, and I wish I could be there in person. I really appreciated the invitation, but my schedule just doesn't allow it this time, and I only got the invite in August, so it was a little. By that point, my year is kind of already in the books, and but I'm glad we could find a way to to have a conversation and to explore this. I was thinking about this a little bit, and given the topic of source keepers, I thought this was a golden opportunity to bring forth something that I've actually wanted to speak more publicly about, that I haven't spoken a lot about in a public setting. And many people, when they come to Aletheia, when they see it at first, they think it's a syncretic tradition. They think it's a kind of synthesis or integration of other methods. But that's actually not what it is. It's actually a coherent teaching that is unfolding, Sarah Marie, as you said, like in these times, in response to these times. And so I wanted to start to talk about how we design in an unfolding way, because just like unfolding itself has been marginalized in our culture, and I believe needs to be pulled into the center, I think that the way that we approach the design of anything, especially when we're talking about wisdom traditions, especially wisdom traditions, but there could even be the design of organizations, the design of services, the design of products, that largely what we need to bring in is a kind of unfolding way of design. And to contrast it with what I think is the prevailing way of design in our current culture is what I might call a fabricating way of design. And I'm kind of taking this distinction from one of my inspirations for Aletheia, kind of a semi-secret inspiration, which is the work of architect Christopher Alexander. And Christopher Alexander, being an architect, was very sensitive to design. And the way architecture is typically done is that you create a blueprint. So the architect is sitting in their office at their drawing board, far, far away from the actual site at which the building will be built. And they're designing something in their mind, and they're creating a blueprint. They're creating a model. And then once that model is good to go, it goes and the builders build it. Like what's happening right here outside my window right now. My builders are building something. And There are definitely advantages to that kind of design. That kind of design, in my view, very much stems from the birth of modernism and the kind of the separation of things. Uh, Modernism brought many great things to us, but it also brought us with this view that man or humans are essentially separate from the world, separate from nature, and therefore we act on the world. And so this is a kind of designing where we figure out what we're going to do to the world, and then we act on the world. And many of us actually relate to ourselves and each other in that kind of a way. We relate to ourselves as if we're acting on ourselves when we try to do self-improvement. And really, the unfolding way of design is a way of acting with the world. And I want to talk a little bit more about how that actually works, because that's actually how Aletheia unfolded as a wisdom teaching in an ecology of practices. It unfolded not because I somehow like studied a bunch of stuff and read a bunch of stuff and then figured it all out, wrote it all down in a model, and then started to bring that to the world. That's not at all how it actually happened. So the thing about an unfolding way of design is that unfoldment is always an unfoldment of innate wholeness into another expression of wholeness. And so we start the project of design with the whole design in some sense. We start with wholeness. Now, very frequently when we're starting with wholeness, most of that wholeness is concealed. In fact, this is part of learning to work with innate wholeness. There is always something of innate wholeness that will always be concealed, no matter how much gets unconcealed and unfolded. So the unfoldment is inexhaustible, in other words. But when we're working with a fabricating kind of design, we don't start with the whole, we start with a bunch of parts and we assemble them together, and then integrate them into a whole. And that's why I say that Aletheia isn't a syncretic tradition, which people imagine I've gathered IFS and focusing and Buddhism and Diamond Approach and esoteric Christianity, and I've kind of somehow found a way to glue it all together, because all of those were the parts and I tried to create a whole. But that's actually not at all what happened. And I think people think that because, of course, the fabricating way of designing is the default way of designing things in our culture. Like this unfolding style of design is very marginal. So the thing to get about an unfolding style of design, because we start with wholeness, is that it's a style of design that is wholeness preserving. And so it's wholeness that unfolds and expresses another form of wholeness endlessly. And so there's a coherency to what unfolds. And I've seen this happen again and again in Aletheia because the teaching and the practice has unfolded over, well, I mean, probably started for me somewhere in maybe like 2006 or 2008, really, if I go back to the origins of when the first bits of this started to really happen. And I had a big integrating insight in 2010. And then I started actually launched a school in 2013. So, but the idea here is that this is wholeness preserving. Fabricating is not wholeness preserving because we don't start with wholeness. So how could we preserve it? We start with a bunch of pieces. We start with a bunch of parts. And it's even worse than that because the fabricating way of designing is actually wholeness destroying. And this is part of the issue that we have in our current culture. My sense is that this metacrisis that we're in, the root cause of that, and I think this is one of the the parlor games of our times, like where are you placing your bets on the root cause, right? Like there could be many totally legitimate and valid root causes, but my favorite one is that the root cause of the metacrisis is a particular way of being human that has prevailed for several hundred years, that largely came out of the birth of modernism, and has kind of spread around the world. and that has things be separate. Culture is separate from nature. We're separate from each other. Races are separate from each other. Ethnic groups are separate from each other. Democrats and Republicans are separate from each other. We could name it. The body is separate from the mind, the heart. Separation everywhere we look, just separation. And it's a link that's probably obvious, so I won't bother really spelling it out, but that whole way of being human has a limited shelf life. It's unsustainable in the long term, in the manner in which it has us acting on and consuming the planet in a certain kind of way, or acting on each other in ways that creates division, polarization, things like that. So, fundamentally, I think what we need is we can't design our way out of the metacrisis, although clearly people will try that because that's the prevailing norm. And yeah, there may be some new technologies that could come along that will be a support. But in my view, the only way to really address the metacrisis is to cultivate a different way of being human than the one that prevails. And if you look at philosophers like Heidegger, who studied the history of being, which means the history of being human, um, because that's our access to being. We study being by studying our own beingness. And he noticed that there were several different epochs where being human was different. And then we're currently in one of those epochs, clearly. And the way of being human right now is largely a technological one. And we view ourselves as technology, which is the real tragedy in some sense, because that is very dehumanizing. So if you're working in the corporate world, you still talk about head counts, and we need, a new person with this job title. Well, we're treating people like Henry Ford treated exchangeable parts in a factory, right? That's very, very dehumanizing. So we can't really create this new way of being human by somehow uh, some kind of gigantic problem analysis and coming up with a solution. This way of being human must be designed in another way. And I think the only other viable alternative is that it unfolds, which means that we have some sense of the kind of practices that we could engage in to allow and support and participate in the unfoldment of that way. But we don't know exactly what that way is going to look like. I'm not sitting here with a solution. I'm sitting here more with an alternative way of cultivating a different way of being human on the planet, an unfolding way. I have a deep hunch that that way itself will be an unfolding way of being human in some manner, but it's got to be an unfolding way of being human that's deeply connected to what's happening in the world. And I think there's a bigger analysis, there's a bigger, not analysis, but there's a bigger sort of participatory design project that requires. And in fact, this is one of the core points, is that an unfolding way of design is fundamentally participatory. It's not the kind of blueprint, observer at a distance, figure it out, then go build. It's, the metaphor that often comes to mind is it's the, rebuilding the airplane as you're flying it kind of metaphor. So what really is required in order to start designing in an unfolding way is you have to learn how to attune to innate wholeness, because the design starts with wholeness. And the way that we learn to attune to innate wholeness is by actually dropping into and embodying and recognizing our innate wholeness, because it's our innate wholeness that functions like a kind of organ of perception of wholeness in others, of wholeness in teams and organizations, wholeness in the world. Um, and so, in a sense, we have to learn how to perceive that. And in our culture, we learn how to perceive parts. We don't learn how to perceive innate wholeness. And you can gauge for yourself just how much you're able to perceive innate wholeness by noticing how frequently you feel like something is missing in you, like something is deficient in you, that you may be trying to remedy through self-improvement. Because when we fall into that sense of self-deficiency, what's happening is that we're not in contact with our innate wholeness. Therefore, how can we see innate wholeness in the world? How could we attune, in a sense, to the logos of a wisdom teaching, so that we can participate with that in a way that unfolds the wisdom teaching without first being able to have the organ of perception of wholeness. And so, and I think this is one way to understand wisdom teachings is that each has its own logos. Each has its, and that logos is the whole that is there at the very beginning. And as we learn to actually work with that, sense that, participate with that wholeness, more and more unfolds from that. So I'm just looking at my notes here to see if there's anything else I wanted to bring in. I think the last thing that I want to bring in here, and then I'm curious to open it up for conversation, is that in order to participate in sensing the logos, in attuning to innate wholeness through our own innate wholeness, you actually have to be at the site of unfoldment. It's a little bit like in a participatory way of designing architecture, you're not an architect in your office away from the building site. The way that you actually do architecture in an unfolding way is at the building site, right? And if you look at the example of Christopher Alexander, you know, he designed an entire university campus in Japan, and there's a whole book written about this. And basically, he would go and walk the land. And he would walk the land and he would have little flags that he would stick in the ground. And he would say, well, I think the edge of a building is here, or I think a pathway is here. And then he would kind of explore it and walk through it. And his whole way of design is interesting because essentially what he was trying to figure out is how does architecture and how does building, how does design support life? And he often found that designs, that buildings were designed in a way that unknowingly um, prevented life from being lived in this kind of fluid manner. And so, and there's more I can say about that, but essentially, wholeness preserving design is a kind of design that is life affirming, that supports life. And in a way, that's exactly what we need. We need to be at the site of unfoldment. So where did Aletheia actually unfold? It unfolded
We
in
have
conversations.
We're gonna push the computer back because we have some people joining.
Okay, cool. Welcome, everybody. So Aletheia actually unfolded face to face with clients. That's the site of the unfoldment of it. It unfolded in the moment of teaching it. It unfolded there. It didn't unfold here in my office, in my room. It didn't unfold anywhere away from that. So you have to be at the site of unfoldment, and you have to take this unfolding way of design that is fundamentally deeply participatory. And you have to, in that moment, be attuned to innate wholeness. So I talked about these different ways of being human, and the prevailing way right now is a technological way of being human. In Aletheia, it's literally lesson number 1, and it's also the very last lesson in our fourth year of our curriculum, is shifting into a poetic way of attuning. Because fundamentally, a poetic way of attuning is an attunement towards innate wholeness. So we have to be able to open to that, attuning to innate wholeness from our innate wholeness, be at the site of unfoldment, and then work to articulate what it is that's unfolding. explore, palpate, feel, embody. And so a lot of people will come to Aletheia not only thinking this is a syncretic tradition, and it's not, but people will also come to it and think that this model that has arrived was the first thing, like a blueprint, and then we went and implemented it. But actually, the model came after the experience as a way of palpating the experience, trying to understand what was happening in those conversations in a way that could be translated to other people so that they might have a way to sort of step in and begin to engage this. And so really what the Aletheia training fundamentally is, it's not about learning a model. This is why it takes 4 years, by the way. It's really about learning to get connected to the logos of the wisdom tradition so that the logos is actually what is coaching. That the logos is actually what is coming through. And partly the challenge in teaching people this is that people don't typically come in understanding this as actually what is being learned, what is being practiced. And so there's a kind of phase of starting to do what looks a little bit like following the steps in a method or doing what I see demonstrated. And then there's this process of kind of unlearning that happens while you're simultaneously learning this unfolding way. And that just takes time and practice to begin to shift. So this is what I wanted to open up with, and to kind of like plant as a seed in the conversation, is this distinction of an unfolding way of being instead of a fabricating way of being. And I think in my view, this is exactly how all wisdom traditions actually emerge into the world. I don't think somebody goes and figures it all out and then just delivers it. In my sense, and I've seen this happen in certain spiritual traditions that I've been in, is the way in which it's unfolding right now in this participatory way at the site of unfoldment. But this is also how wisdom traditions remain relevant. Because if it was all figured out and it's just brought down, that risks some kind of orthodoxy or some kind of fundamentalism. And that's always going to be out of tune with actually what is needed in this moment, especially in the times that we're living in where change is accelerating so much. So that's my sense of how this goes from my experience.
For sharing, Steve. It's very rich. I'm really curious about the integrating insight that you mentioned in 2010 and kind of how you what that first contact felt like with the logos of Aletheia and with how you followed that thread. Like, was that the integrating insight around this unfolding and from wholeness versus trying to integrate all these different practices that you've been studying over many years?
My best guess about where I first encountered the Aletheia logos was exactly in sitting in coaching conversations with clients. At the time, I wasn't clearly coaching in an Aletheia way. I was coaching in a different way. I was faculty for another coach training school. I'd learned another method. It was a very integrally informed method, very developmental. That's what I was really into at the time. And what I noticed is that it didn't always work. And sometimes it would work. Sometimes I could see it be really powerful. But to be honest with you, I'd say the majority of the time it didn't work. And back in those days, I thought, well, that's on me. I need to continue to develop and learn, which was also true. So I went out and I learned different forms of psychotherapy, different forms of somatic work, and many coaches will do the same thing. So I learned all these different things and practiced them. And I noticed the same thing, though. They all worked, but they also failed to work. And so I sat really in the question of what explains this. I'm having these experiences. These methods are also different from each other. They all work and they also all fail. So what explains this? And I think it's that kind of a question that helps you to get connected to the logos at the site of unfoldment that you find yourself in, right? So, I'm talking here about coaching, but if you're going to be like I don't know, a political activist or something like that, the site of unfoldment is not a coaching conversation for you, probably. I don't know. I'm not a political activist, but wherever political activists go to do political activism, that's the site of unfoldment for them, right? Mine was mine was coaching, and I was noticing what explains what I'm actually experiencing. Because in a sense, if I looked at the explanation from any of these different approaches, it sort of worked, it sort of fit, and it sort of didn't. And if their explanation was complete and coaching in that way or practicing therapy in that way was complete, it would always work. And so the integrating insight that happened to me, and I kind of sat with that question for a few years, was that all methods work, but they work at different depths. And when a client is attuned to themselves at a particular depth, meeting them there with a method that is skillful at that depth works. But what I noticed is that when you do that, the client will spontaneously deepen in contact. And if you still keep trying to meet them with the same method, now that method doesn't work as well anymore. And so so this is an example of something of the Aletheia logos in that moment unfolded for me as an insight that helped me actually understand what I was actually experiencing in my conversations with clients. Right? So I was engaged and participating, really open to what was happening, not trying to force any particular model on what's happening, any particular view. Um, and notice it. And anytime I did that, which is kind of unavoidable to a certain extent, to take a certain kind of view, anytime I did that, I just noticed that the view would break at some point. The practice would break at some point. So it's being in that participatory engagement that actually allows for the unfoldment. The curious thing, and I've experienced this again and again in Aletheia, when you design in this unfolding way, what newly emerges is always coherent with what has emerged. So it's been remarkable how the practice has continued every year. There are new things that are emerging, but what newly emerges never violates what has been before. So I never say, oh, wow, I really get it. What we've been doing is completely wrong in this way. I now have the truth. Let's go back and fix all of that. It actually doesn't work like that. It's more like there's some new question that emerges out of experience, just like my question of how does everything work and not work? And sitting in that question, what explains this, or what is this? I'm trying to understand this, that something new will emerge. But the listening is poetically attuned from innate wholeness. And so one of the reasons why people will think that I've integrated different methods is because I've tried to practice different methods. And so those methods have inevitably influenced what has been occurring in coaching conversations. But if you actually notice, like Aletheia Parts work is actually not IFS. And this point has been made even clearer to me because I've recently been on faculty with Dick Schwartz in a Coaches Rising program. And I've seen now very recent demos of his, and he's doing things very differently than we are. I used to think I've always thought we're different, clearly, but I used to think we were closer than we actually are. We're actually further apart now that I see his most recent work. And I think I could say that throughout everything. So that's the big insight.
When you talked earlier about having someone figuring it all out and then handing it down as like, this is how it's going to go, I had a very clear image of the prototypical kind of the 10 Commandments. Like,
Exactly.
I figured it out. Here's the list. Go do it. And I was like, oh, wow, what an archetypal story that we're taught when we're so young. Those of us who were taught that.
Right.
How that takes the responsibility of participating and discovering the solution out of us and says that there's someone out there with an answer, and that we should just take that on as a prescription. And
Yeah.
how empowering that story actually is for the people who are receiving the commandment.
Yeah. And then the question becomes, I think it's really relevant for our conversation, like if this fabricating way of designing, like to have the blueprint and then to give it to people to build, is the prevailing way in our culture, how do you bridge people from that into an unfolding way of design? Right? Because if I just basically, I mean, one option, this is not what I do, but one option, just to throw it out, is to basically have people do what I did. So they would sit there in front of a person, under the context of you're going to coach this person, and they would try a bunch of things and see what works and what doesn't work, and hang on to that question until they had some kind of insight, right? Now that's totally plausible. That was what happened for me. But that, first of all, I'm a weirdo that I actually stuck with that project for as long as I did. I think most people would probably give it up pretty quickly, right? And the learning journey wouldn't be a few years. It would be 15 years, like it was for me, right? And so that I don't, and who knows, maybe what would even unfold from that wouldn't look at all like Aletheia. It would look like something else, and that would also be coherent and probably workable, right? Like, and that's a project that's probably being done by other weirdos like me in the world, and they're producing their body of work in this particular way, which is needed, right? There's not just one way. All that is needed. But the experiment that I've been doing is, given the model that has been sort of articulated out of those experiences, is almost to present it as if we have a blueprint that we're then going to implement. But there is a kind of sort of secret little twist in the middle of that blueprint, which is that the blueprint, which gives people some orienting distinctions and gives some language that we can start to develop professionally so we can talk about what we're doing amongst us coaches. But what it does in the middle of it is it points people, as they follow to implement the blueprint, it points people directly into the site of unfoldment. And so they're actually beginning to experience a taste of the very practice itself, in a kind of in the kind of immediacy of working with a particular person. So there's this kind of, we're starting in a way where the culture thinks we should be starting, because to not do that is often to activate a lot of intuitive opposition, right? But then to actually have a kind of shift unfold through that into an unfolding way that naturally occurs, and so that somebody who is deep into the curriculum has actually learned how to listen to the logos themselves. So it's a kind of sort of bootstrapping model of really meeting people in the culture where they are, but in a way that actually takes them in a different direction than what they suspect. So I think that's also relevant for this conversation.
something that's been bubbling as like surfacing in listening to you. We had a phone call with Ria Beck yesterday, and I've been in that practice for some years now. And we were talking about what is sourcing or source keeping from the middle. And being with that inquiry helped me to see that a project that is very alive and is like my central source keeping project at the moment, that it's very emerge in nature. And that feels, as you're talking about unfolding design in this way of unfolding, that feels like another way of framing it or languaging it. And feels actually like something that I'm really coming home to, that is very true to me, and I'm sort of learning to trust and follow more and more, allow for. Yeah, in some way that there is sort of an initial, like receiving an initial impulse. And I want to actually pause here. There's something in how you were talking that makes me want to look closer at this moment. I kind of feel like taking a step back, even, there's sort of it begins by feeling what's not working. Yeah, there's a like grinding in the what's not working, and moving towards resonance, towards life force. And that's how I feel like I've landed with many of these others, is like finding these pockets of resonance, and like cooking there, some alchemy seems to stir that kind of like drops in these like oh, this. And there is some sense of like an initial design, an initial yeah, like core. But I'm really finding that from there, it's sort of like putting it out into life, and actually like seeing how reality receives it, and learning actually what it is to become. It's almost like it begins there, but then it's a sculpture that starts to emerge. Yeah, and the unfolding.
Exactly it.
So helpful here, like, right.
Yeah, so unfolding is the way nature designs. It's really the primordial way of designing. It's always been this way. And I like to say that, and I think it's true, that it's likely that the vast, vast majority of transformation and change that any of us have ever experienced has unfolded. If you think of just all the change that happens and unfolds through childhood, it wasn't as a result of a self-improvement project. It wasn't as a result of giving a child some kind of developmental assessment and some kind of program of disciplined practices and readings that they were supposed to do in order to get them to the next stage. No, what you do is you just relate to them. You relate to them, you talk with them, you get curious about them, you explore reality, you look, you pay attention to them, all these things, right? I love what you said about like this kind of like feeling. My language is what happens when we listen from innate wholeness, when we listen from the organ of perception of innate wholeness, is that we're automatically sensitized to truth, beauty, and goodness. And in particular, beauty is really the design sensibility here. So inquiry is often an orientation towards truth. Like, I want to know what's true here. And that's certainly a piece of this. But there's a sensitivity towards beauty. And the way I often find that it shows up is through a sensitivity towards disharmony and harmony. Because when we notice that something is disharmonious, that's in fact the direction to take your curiosity in. That's what to respond to. That's what to explore, feel, understand. And in so doing, what tends to naturally unfold is a deeper harmony. There's a resolution to what is disharmonious. And so it's kind of back to taking this sort of poetic way of attuning. That way of attuning is an attunement towards harmony and disharmony. And so when I was basically sitting, when I had learned all these different methods, in a disharmony. The disharmony was, why doesn't this work? Right? And I could see that it did work. And that's what was disharmonious. It worked and it doesn't work. What's with this? And it's sitting in that disharmony that is the site of unfoldment, right? So when a client shares something and they're like, I don't know what this is, my ears perk up. I'm like, Oh, you don't know what this is. I don't know what this is either. Let's find out. Let's give it some space. Let's give it some time. How can this be embodied and felt more fully? So I wanted to underscore that sensitivity, because I think that's really central in this.
Yeah, that's super helpful. There's another piece that you're touching on around like experience near and experience distant design.
Right.
And that feels very resonant too. And something that I'm feeling in this circle of humans that's kind of like honing, it's like getting better and better. It's a lot of really brilliant humans. And so easy to go experience distant.
Yeah.
And there's something very embodied happening at this gathering. There's some kind of integration, much more staying close to experience, and yeah, the how to design from there feels like, oh, I'll have to watch for that. You have more to say about that?
I'm glad to hear that. Yeah, I do think that there's a natural oscillation between experience distance and experience near. And this gets us back to the whole distinction around being at the site of unfoldment, that we kind of need both. And a lot of times the way that goes is we have a core practice of called feeling saying. But so we're in contact with our experience, but we're giving voice to it. We're trying to articulate it, we're trying to share it. And it's a process that as we give voice to it, more feeling comes. So we're feeling, saying, feeling, saying, feeling, saying, feeling, saying. And this I sometimes call the engine of unfoldment. It moves things. And the saying is just expressing. It could be gesture, it could be movement, feeling movement, right? But there needs to be some way that we bring what we feel and experience into language, even if it's movement language. And one of the ways I understand this is that being in this kind of feeling place is very right-brained, but bringing it into language is very left-brained. And in a way, there's this kind of practice, this engagement actually moves us into a whole brain state, and in a whole brain state that also is a support for attuning to innate wholeness. So there are some of these things that have unfolded in the method that it's almost like the method that has unfolded um, from the logos of Aletheia is one in which um, more efficiently helps people to connect to the logos of Aletheia, right? And so all these little things have unfolded as ways of doing that. And I suspect it's probably something with just about every different wisdom tradition. I think this is part of how it goes. I know that when we work with wisdom vehicles in Aletheia, that each vehicle is a particular way of poetically attuning. And when we adjust and refine our poetic attunement, and there are many different poetic attunements, it's a way of refining our sensitivity to disharmony. So we will find different kinds of disharmonies depending upon how we attune. And the more we work with those disharmonies in a way that brings a greater harmony, a resolving harmony, what happens is we become even more aligned with the wisdom of that particular vehicle. The question that I would have for all of you, or the invitation, is like, what is the site of unfoldment for you in terms of what you're drawn to do in the world, who you're drawn to serve in the world, and how are you really staying with what's actually happening there, both what's working, what's not working. How are you opening to those moments of non-obviousness, those moments of disharmony, those moments when you don't know, what's happening, when you don't know what to do, when you don't know what should be happening, when you don't know what direction this needs to go in. And many of us will have parts that try to protect us from those moments, or when those moments begin to open up, they distract us, or they deny that, or they close it down because it feels too threatening to be in this place of uncertainty. It's too anxiety provoking to be in this place of, I don't know what this is. And all of that is actually in the way of attuning to innate wholeness in a way that will unfold a wisdom tradition. So instead, we have to begin to cultivate a way of opening up into those moments of non-obviousness, those moments of not knowing, um, and those moments of disharmony in some sense. And I think that's the tricky bit. That's why there aren't just a proliferation of wisdom traditions happening everywhere. I think it's not common in our culture to want to tolerate that for very long.
Help you tolerate it over the years, and how you've worked with the discomfort and the not knowing, and maybe even doubt arising along the way, aligning your life in this direction, unfolding Aletheia.
Well, I had to work with all the parts of me that were uncomfortable with that. So I also had parts that were uncomfortable that felt like, uh, especially because I was working as a professional coach. So people were paying me money. They're paying me good money, and I'm sitting there and I don't know what's happening, and I don't know what to do. And you better bet I had parts that got triggered that were like, people are paying you money for this. Like, you can't just sit here and not know what to say, not know what to do. That doesn't work, right? So it turns out that that is what works. It turns out that that is a very necessary part of this. And so I had to work with the parts of me that were triggered by that. And you also, Sabra, mentioned the kind of trust in this process that develops. And I think that's one thing that's really important, is that as I started to shift into this way of coaching and designing, I started to develop an unflappable trust in unfoldment itself. Now, that did not happen overnight, right? That took several years to unfold, which is again why I think the transition into this is not just like a weekend workshop or something like that. It's actually practicing over several years. There are things that really need to change um, in our biology, in our way of being, and we have to kind of kick the tires and test it in order to be able to actually feel this sense of deep trust. So,
I just love this this phrase, the site of our unfoldment. I haven't heard that before. And I was sensing that for me, this gathering is the site of my unfoldment, in the sense of, feels like the deepest expression of my soul vow meets the deepest impact of service in one configuration. And yeah, for sure. I mean, so much of this gathering is around being in the unfolding of the wholeness and not knowing, and the mystery, and holding that collectively.
yeah.
If I was to do that individually as just one person, I think I could do that, but I find there's such a deeper joy in being and having collaborators like Daniel, who's just off screen, and Cheryl and Sabra, and there's like a field, an interpersonal collective field between us that can hold both more depth and complexity and nuance in seeing, because we're more bodies. But then also there's when one of us does have a part that's activated, we can all resource each other, and that can be more supportive for the larger field as well.
I think that's right. The thing that's interesting when you start to study how to perceive innate wholeness, how to attune to that, you really come into this idea of innate wholeness as holographic. And what that means is that the whole comes first, and any part is expressive of that whole. And so this is how we can encounter something, that seems to like fit inside of a culture, or something that's disharmonious to a culture. Like every time I travel the world and see another McDonald's, in some far-flung part of the world, it just feels disharmonious because I'm like, this is an American culture thing. Not that I like it as a part of American culture, but this is just an example of something that kind of stands out because it's not really of this place, right? Um, so the thing to get is that if all we have are parts and we aren't yet able to really sense and attune to the innate wholeness that they express, the more parts we can gather, the more precisely we can sense the innate wholeness. And I think that's the power of gathering in groups, because in a sense, it's as if each of us has a part that expresses the larger innate wholeness. And as we come together, that innate wholeness becomes more palpable and more precisely palpable. So, and you can see this with holographic film. Like if you take a holographic picture, um, and you cut the film in half and you shine a laser in it, you still get the same picture, but the resolution decreases. So the picture is fuzzier. And if you cut the film in half again and you shine the laser, you still get the whole picture, but it just gets fuzzier and fuzzier and fuzzier. But if you include all those pieces together, the clarity and precision comes back. So I think there's an analogous thing that can happen as we gather in groups, is that we as a collective can learn to cultivate the organ of perception of wholeness in that kind of a way. So I think that's part of the benefit of these kind of gatherings.
I'll just add to that. I just really loved what you said, and that part of the prayer of this one gathering is that it's a drop in the river of an unfolding culture that will become the sort of the birthright norm of our grandchildren, let's say.
Yeah.
Yeah, just offering that.
Yeah.
That thing that was spoken in the recent days about village, you know, that this is like a moment, a few days of feeling into living in village, and there's many iterations of actualizing village, and they're each an experience of village. Yeah.
Yeah. That's beautiful. You know, I feel I've been doing some writing lately that I hope to share over the course of the rest of the year on navigating in a post-capitalist, post-career world. And, you know, it's my sense that what our culture, the kind of life design strategy that our culture gives us is go build a career. And, you know, the school system is built for that. And our government policies are built around that, except that whole model is broken, you know, and I think that it's been broken probably arguably for at least 20 years, maybe even longer. But AI is accelerating us even further into the post-career world. So what replaces career as a central feature of life design? And I think what replaces it, or at least what I'm going to nominate and explore, is I think unfolding a life replaces building a career. The challenge that we have is that the government education system that we go through really is so outdated. It's really built to produce industrial workers and managers. It was built and designed in the times of an industrial revolution. I think the coaching industry has been, in some sense, really with the birth of kind of like the knowledge economy, the network economy has been a kind of complementary education system that's fed that. But there's a big problem with that, is that most of the coaching industry is fed into the seeking self-improvement paradigm, where it's all about higher performance. It's really fed hustle culture. And the result of that is the burnout society that we live in. And so I'm actually gonna make a pretty daring move starting next year to no longer call Aletheia a fourth generation of coaching method, but to begin calling it a different category other than coaching. And it's currently I'm thinking of just calling it unfolding, and calling it unfolding is not without risk at all because it's an obscure term in the culture. But I'm feeling like there's a moment, there's a cultural moment that's happening right now. And I think if and this is the intent of the writing I'm doing right now, if I can hold a clear enough mirror up to the culture and help people to see the way in which they're trying to improve is actually making things worse. And this has been my pitch around Aletheia for several years now, but I'm kind of sharpening it. That the interest in an alternative um, will actually increase. And so it's kind of taking the messaging that I've had around Aletheia for probably about 4 or 5 years now, and kind of just taking it in a more taking a stronger stance in some way, uh, uh, and differentiating what we're doing even more, um, and and really starting to explore um, how do we create an unfolding approach to life. And I think that a big piece of it, in terms of replacing building a career, is actually cultivating an entrepreneurial way of being. And entrepreneurism has also been something that has been valorized in our culture, you know, the Steve Jobs and the Elon Musks of the world and things like that. But a lot of people don't see themselves in that way. And that's probably actually a good thing because they're entrepreneurs, but of a very sort of unique, I would even argue, distorted kind. But there's something more fundamental to an entrepreneurial way of being in the sense of learning how to actually weave yourself into the social fabric and be of service to a population of people and understand actually how to extend offers into the world that allow you to address your own financial concerns, your own life concerns. So there's a whole skill set there, and I've been teaching courses in entrepreneurship off and on for the last 15 years, um, mostly to coaches, because learning how to coach is one thing, learning how to be in business as a coach is a completely different skill set. And so I think that that's something that's also been part of the Aletheia logos that I've kind of had on the shelf for a while. The last time I ran that was during COVID, because that was another cultural moment where things were shifting, and I think it's time to bring that work back. Um, and so that's kind of some of the new projects that are coming is really even moving away in some sense from calling what we're doing coaching. Can still be used as coaches. What we also teach can be used by psychotherapists. We have psychotherapists in our trainings all the time. Can be used by social workers. We have social workers in our trainings. So really to call it coaching, I think, for in a number of ways is no longer appropriate.
And how does it, as a wisdom tradition, play into that? Because it feels like it has that range as well, and but different for meeting people where they're at, sort of.
Well, here's the thing, like, you know, and I do hold Aletheia as a wisdom tradition, but it's a wisdom tradition that is actually, you know, as I like to say, we as Aletheia coaches get invited into the corporate world to do work where they're not necessarily inviting people in you know, who are in other kinds of traditional religious institutions and things like that. You know, we do live in a very secularized world. And so, you know, how do we actually bring authentic wisdom, teachings, and practices, um, reinvent it in a way that actually meets people exactly where they are, facing the exact kind of challenges that they're facing, right? The Buddha never had to deal with AI and crypto, right? What do Buddhist teachings say about that? So, but our clients do, and we do. And so we're in that world. So we have the opportunity again to find ourselves at the site of unfoldment and actually unfolding this in a form that is unique to our times. Like that's actually what's needed.
I have a curiosity around, there's several teachers that are here, and to me there feels like a clear distinction when one is, these are just words that I use, but when one is apprenticing and prototyping their offering and they're still kind of exploring and experimenting, and then when one is kind of like solidified their teaching and their offering, and now it's about sharing it through as different expressions. And there feels just like a threshold that's crossed. And I'm hearing in your own story that there was, yeah, I'm curious when you felt, you said Aletheia was sourced in your sessions with your clients, and when you felt, I guess, confident enough in the distilled articulation of it to now be able to to train others essentially in that. Like, was there a specific moment where that happened?
What's interesting is that I didn't actually have confidence in Aletheia in the way that I'm currently teaching it, because I didn't start with it this way. Aletheia officially was launched as a business. It wasn't even called Aletheia then, but in 2013, and I renamed it Aletheia, I think like a year and a half later, something like that. It was originally called a School of Integral Unfoldment, and which was a mouthful, and so I wanted to go to just a word. And integral at the time was being kind of sucked up by Ken Wilber as something that he wanted to really have as his brand. And so I didn't want to always have to kind of fight in that direction, because although I was inspired by his work, it wasn't, what we're doing is not really derivative of his work in any way. So what's interesting is what I started with wasn't a faith in the method. What I started with was a faith in the inquiry that I was in the midst of being with clients, and continuing to want to understand what's happening here, what's true. In some sense, that was the method at that point in time, because it was like that the whole was there already. The whole is there from the beginning in an unfolding style of design. We don't start with the parts and assemble a whole. The whole is there from the beginning. But all I had at the beginning was, so what's happening right now? Like, was that inquiry, that question, that desire to know. And even though I didn't have, all that I have today in terms of what is unfolded as the method, there was already a faith and trust in the sufficiency of that, because I could feel that there was something already complete in that. And that's what wholeness actually feels like. There is a sense of completeness, but completeness doesn't mean it's now never changing. And people who hang around in the Aletheia community, and especially people who retake classes or who come in as assistants and mentors for classes, even if it's only been a year, they frequently will say, I noticed how much you've changed the class, because the classes are constantly evolving, right? And in my view, that's what happens in any living tradition. And so what that means is that we're still listening to the logos, we're still working, we're still practicing at the site of unfoldment. More is coming every single year, more clarity, more refinement. Sometimes it's in the method, sometimes it's in the how to teach the method. But it's interesting that faith and trust was there really early on. And that's what allowed me to step in and to feel like I had something to offer. Even though if you were to actually look at, so the funny thing is, for those of you who are in it, I'm well known for producing and giving massive amounts of materials. For the first 8 years, I gave no materials, zero, for 8 years. So all we did was move into the practice, see what unfolds, right? Um, I know this transition that you're talking about though, like between kind of being in preparation and then being ready to kind of go live. And from a practical standpoint, there may be such a moment, like finally putting up your website or finally making an offer into the world for money as opposed to doing it on the cheap or pro bono or something like that. There is often some kind of moment there as well. But in my view, that moment is actually less dependent upon the work itself and more dependent upon your own preparation, how you sit with yourself in that. So many people will never cross that barrier because where they're sitting with themselves is always in a view of self-deficiency. It's like, this isn't enough. I don't have it worked out enough. I don't have all of the answers, and so it's less about developing. I think it's less about developing the work to a certain state. It's more about developing yourself to a certain state so that you can say, this is the work, and this work is a living tradition. It will continue to grow, and in 2 years, it will look very different. In 5 years, it will look even more different. But that's the way that goes. And I have coached people who've been struggling with, they have something to say to the world, but they don't have all of the answers, and so they never say what they have to say. And that's a tragedy, right? Um, so again, it's kind of back to this, in our culture, this fabricating way of design prevails, and we think we have to have the blueprint before we can go and implement it. And yeah, that can work in limited circumstances. Like, I'm glad my builders have a blueprint, the ones that are working right there outside my window right now. I'm glad they have a blueprint, although it's remarkable how oftentimes the building doesn't match the blueprint. We've had to work with them around that. But mostly we don't learn this unfolding way of design in our culture. We don't learn it at school. Um, in some instances, people in the creative arts tend to be more aware of this, and they tend to learn it. But again, that's a marginalized population in our world. It's like, who makes a living as a poet? Well, some people do, obviously, but a lot of people write poetry, and it's not really about making a living because it's not as valued in our culture.
Two art school grads right here.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, my wife has got a fine arts degree as well, and I've talked to her a lot about this and about her art education, and it's really clear to me that an unfolding way of painting or an unfolding way of writing or of doing things is is a lot of what is learned there. But mostly in our culture, when we go to design something, that's not the way that people are approaching it. And I think that's problematic. And I think, back to the metacrisis, that we can't design by fabrication our way out of the metacrisis. It's just not going to work. So for me, the urgency of bringing the unfolding paradigm and the unfolding way of designing more into the central conversation is dire. And this is why I think that I want to really start to put the message out about how unfolding a life replaces building a career. Because I think that a lot of people in this day and age are actually struggling to build a career. It's like, this kind of cocktail party question, like, so what do you do? How do people answer that these days? It's like, well, I write on my Substack a little bit. I've got a Patreon account. I run some classes. I'm a coach. I'm a content creator. Like, we're like juggling all these different things, and this is a lot of us, right? Like, so how does that work, right? Yeah, I mean, we're all doing this, right? So that's just the way it goes in this day and age. That's why I say we're living in the times of post-career. And it's, I think, largely been the product of the internet and the network society. So it's clearly this is the world we have to respond to. This is the world we have to live in.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Steve.
you.
We're coming.
Lots
yes.
more. I have so many questions. And we...
Well, this has been a fun conversation. I hope it's been helpful, and I've been wanting to kind of wrap for a bit on an unfolding way of design in a more public setting. And so I hope that feel free to share this wherever it seems appropriate. And it's a message that I'm going to look to get out in a bunch of different ways over the coming years.
Amazing.
Awesome.
Awesome.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Steve. So appreciate in the world.
Here. Bye-bye.